When the HOA slapped a $5,000 fine on me for illegal hunting in my own backyard, I thought it was just another petty flex of their imaginary power. I wasn't poaching, I wasn't trespassing, and I wasn't breaking any law. Unless you count the unwritten HOA commandment. Thou shalt bow to Karen and her clipboard. The nerve of it. They fined me for firing a legal rifle on my property, land my family had owned for decades, while the same HOA board spent weekends parading through the woods, my woods, with their hiking clubs, trampling trails they didn't even own. So I did what any reasonable man pushed too far would do. I made some calls, spoke to a few landowners, and signed a deal that would change the game forever. When the ink dried, the HOA's favorite hiking trails, every last step of them, belonged to me. And on the very next Monday, a fresh sign went up. Private property. No trespassing. Trail closed permanently. That was the day I stopped being their victim and became their worst nightmare. I had always thought of my little stretch of countryside as a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world dulled into silence and the land carried the kind of peace only open skies and unbroken fields can give. It wasn't fancy, not the sort of place you'd see in glossy real estate magazines, but it was mine, acres of tall grass rolling toward the tree line, a small pond that glimmered in the sunlight, and the distant call of hawks circling lazily overhead. I grew up out here, learning to track deer with my father, splitting firewood beside him, and hearing him tell me, "Son, the land remembers who respects it and who abuses it." For me, hunting wasn't about trophies on the wall or filling some primal urge, it was about carrying on a tradition of respect. So when the HOA decided to fine me $5,000 for doing what my father and grandfather had always done, I knew something more than money was at stake. It started with the crack of a rifle echoing across the valley one Saturday morning. I had spotted a whitetail buck grazing near the edge of the woods, broad-shouldered and cautious, ears twitching at every whisper of the wind. I lined up my shot, heart steady, and when the echo faded, the silence afterward felt almost sacred. I was dragging the animal back toward my truck when I heard the crunch of gravel from the road and saw a white Lexus creeping up the drive. My stomach sank the moment I recognized it, Karen's car. Karen was the HOA president, a woman who seemed to draw power from making everyone else miserable, her blonde bob cut sharper than her tone and her oversized sunglasses covering eyes that somehow still managed to glare straight through you. She stepped out, pastel cardigan spotless despite the dusty road, clutching her clipboard as if it were a badge of authority. Well, she said, pursing her lips as though I'd just been caught robbing a church, do you realize you've just committed a serious violation of HOA regulations? I wiped the sweat from my forehead and stared at her, half convinced I'd misheard. Violation, Karen, I'm hunting, on my land, it's deer season, perfectly legal. She adjusted her sunglasses with one manicured finger, unimpressed. The HOA has very clear rules about firearms, noise ordinances, and the safety of our community. Discharging a weapon within community grounds is strictly prohibited. I let out a laugh, one of those short, disbelieving ones that comes out sharper than intended. Community grounds. This isn't a cul-de-sac playground, Karen. This is my property, outside the HOA's jurisdiction. You and your rules don't stretch this far. Her smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that told you she'd already decided the outcome. Oh, but they do. The HOA charter extends to all properties within the mapped boundaries, and I've already documented your little escapade. You'll be receiving a fine in the mail. I stared at her, the buck lying at my feet, the rifle still slung over my shoulder. It was surreal, like being arrested by a mall cop who thought she was FBI. You can't fine me for hunting on my own land. You'll find that we can, she said smoothly, turning back toward her Lexus. $5,000, payable within 30 days. Consider yourself lucky we don't report you for endangering the community. And with that, she clicked her heels back to the car, the dust swirling around her like a curtain closing on a theater performance. The engine hummed, the car rolled off, and I stood there, watching her taillights vanish into the trees, my hands shaking not with fear but with fury. The letter came 3 days later, sealed in a pristine white envelope with the HOA's smug logo embossed on the corner. It was everything Karen had promised. Official letterhead, legal jargon, and a fine for reckless discharge of a firearm, violation of HOA hunting prohibitions, and endangerment of residents. $5,000. I turned the paper over in my hands again and again, as if the words might shift into something sane if I stared hard enough. But they didn't. I remember slamming the letter down on the kitchen table so hard my coffee cup jumped, splashing brown rings onto the wood. The absurdity of it burned hotter than the unfairness. This wasn't about safety, or noise, or community values. This was about control, about a woman with too much time and too little sense deciding she could dictate the way I lived on land my family had owned before the HOA even existed. The gall of it was almost impressive in its own twisted way. I paced the kitchen, my boots thudding against the floorboards, my mind replaying the scene. Her smug smile, her threats, the way she said, community, like it was her personal kingdom. Who in their right mind thought they could outlaw hunting in the middle of the countryside? This wasn't some manicured subdivision with picket fences and kids playing hopscotch in the street. This was wide open land, wild and untamed, where coyotes howled at night and hawks picked off field mice in broad daylight. You don't tame that with a rulebook. Neighbors started whispering within days. Some called to say they'd heard about my incident, their voices laced with pity. Others avoided me at the market, afraid that being seen with me would put them on Karen's blacklist. That was her power, not real authority, but intimidation, the kind that seeped through the cracks of daily life until you wondered whether standing up for yourself was worth the headache. But for me, it wasn't a question. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. If I rolled over, if I paid that fine, I'd be admitting they had power over me, power to dictate every detail of my life from the color of my fence to whether I could breathe the air without filling out a form first. No, that wasn't going to happen. Not on my land, not while I was still breathing. Still, I couldn't deny the knot of dread in my gut. $5,000 was no joke. The letter threatened escalating penalties, liens, and legal recourse. It read like the HOA was ready to march into court waving their little rulebook like it was the Constitution. I pictured Karen standing in front of a judge, pearl earrings gleaming, voice dripping with righteous indignation, painting me as some reckless outlaw firing bullets into baby strollers. The thought made me laugh out loud, though it was the bitter kind of laughter that curdles in your throat. I took a walk that evening, the sunset painting the horizon in strokes of orange and purple, the air sharp with the coming chill. My boots crunched on the dirt path leading to the woods, the same trail my father had walked 1,000 times before me. I paused at the tree line, listening to the rustle of leaves, the distant croak of frogs by the pond, and I thought about legacy. About the absurdity of one self-appointed queen trying to erase generations of tradition with a signature on a clipboard. That was the moment the fine stopped being a nuisance and became a declaration of war. They wanted to make an example out of me. They wanted to show the whole community what happened when you dared to step outside their lines. But they had underestimated one thing. I wasn't some timid homeowner worried about whether my lawn ornaments matched the approved catalog. I wasn't afraid of being embarrassed at the next board meeting. I was a man with deep roots in this land, roots older than their entire charter, and when you come after a man like that, you'd better be ready for the fight of your life. So I folded the letter back into its envelope, slid it into the drawer beside my father's old hunting knife, and told myself this wasn't the end. No, this was only the opening move. And Karen, for all her smug confidence, had just made the biggest mistake of her career. She'd woken up the wrong man. If the fine itself had been a slap in the face, the HOA meeting that followed was the slap followed by Karen's smug hand waiting expectantly for me to say, "Thank you." I'd debated whether to even show up, but curiosity and anger are powerful motivators, and by the time I parked my truck outside the bland beige community center, my blood was already simmering. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like annoyed insects, and the folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a long table where Karen and her loyal board members sat like royalty about to pass judgment. She spotted me the moment I walked in, her lips curling into the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse that's already caught in its claws. "Ah, Mr. Turner," she said into the microphone, her voice magnified and syrupy sweet. "I see you've decided to join us. Good. Transparency is very important to this community." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes and instead found a chair near the middle of the room. Around me, neighbors shifted in their seats. Some offered sympathetic nods, others avoided my gaze entirely, pretending to study the agenda printed on thin white paper. The irony wasn't lost on me. Most of these folks lived for gossip, yet when it came time to stand up to Karen, they all folded like cheap lawn chairs. The meeting droned on for a while, budget allocations, landscaping schedules, an absurd debate about whether garden gnomes should be allowed if they were tasteful. My patience frayed thinner with every passing minute. Finally, Karen cleared her throat dramatically, shuffled her papers, and announced, "Next item on the agenda, enforcement of community regulations concerning dangerous activities." Her eyes cut straight to me, gleaming with satisfaction. As you may have heard, a resident was recently found discharging a firearm within the community boundaries. This reckless act posed a grave risk to safety and tranquility. The board has issued an appropriate fine and will now open the floor for discussion. The room buzzed with murmurs. I stood, the metal legs of my chair scraping against the linoleum floor, and all eyes turned to me. You mean me, I said flatly. Let's not dance around it. I hunted. Legally, on my property. I didn't break the law, and I sure as hell didn't endanger anyone. What I did do is exercise a right that people in this county have enjoyed for generations. So if you're going to stand up there and pretend like I'm some kind of criminal, at least have the guts to say it plain. Karen gave a little laugh, the kind that was meant to sound indulgent but landed like nails on a chalkboard. Mr. Turner, this isn't personal. These rules exist for the good of the entire community. Imagine what could happen if someone had been hiking nearby. That's when I snapped. Funny you should bring that up, Karen. Because just last weekend I saw you and half this board traipsing through the very woods you're fining me for using. Carrying granola bars and selfie sticks like it was your own personal nature preserve. You mean to tell me that's safe, but me hunting, as people have done on that land for decades, is somehow reckless? A ripple went through the room, whispers spreading like wildfire. Karen's cheeks flushed pink, though she quickly masked it with another tight smile. Community hikes are a sanctioned activity, she said firmly. Organized, supervised, and respectful of the environment. Respectful, I barked out a laugh. You left candy wrappers on the trail, stomped through nesting grounds, and one of your board members thought it was funny to chase a turkey for a photo op. Don't talk to me about respect. You're not protecting the land, you're exploiting it for your little weekend socials. And then you have the audacity to fine me for doing the one thing that actually requires skill, patience, and respect for the land itself. That's not about safety, Karen. That's about control. The room erupted into quiet chaos, neighbors whispering, a few gasps, one or two chuckles muffled by nervous hands. Karen's fingers clenched around her microphone. Mr. Turner, your hostility is noted. But the fact remains, the HOA has rules, and those rules must be followed. If you're unhappy, you're welcome to take it up with our legal counsel. I stepped closer to the front, ignoring the stares burning into my back. Oh, I intend to. But let me make one thing clear to everyone in this room. Those woods don't belong to the HOA. They don't belong to Karen. They belong to the landowners. People like me. You think you own those trails because you slapped them on a flyer and called them community hikes, but the truth is you're trespassing every time you step foot out there. And maybe, just maybe, it's time someone reminded you where the real boundaries are. Karen's eyes narrowed behind her sunglasses, which she wore indoors like a villain in a bad soap opera. Are you threatening us, Mr. Turner? No, I said, lowering my voice so it carried sharp and clear. I'm promising you. The silence that followed was electric, the kind that tightens your chest and makes the air feel thick. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One older gentleman coughed into his fist. Then Karen banged her gavel, a sound that cracked through the tension like a gunshot. That's enough. The board has made its decision. The fine stands. This matter is closed. But it wasn't closed, not for me. As I walked out of that suffocating room, the sound of whispered gossip trailing behind me, I felt a knot of fury in my chest solidify into something sharper, something more dangerous. They thought they'd humiliated me, boxed me in, forced me to play by their rules. But what they didn't realize, what Karen in all her smug arrogance couldn't comprehend, was that they'd handed me the perfect weapon, their hypocrisy. Because the truth was, they didn't own those trails they loved so much. They assumed, they acted like it, they strutted through them as if their HOA dues somehow bought them the right. But assumption isn't ownership, and ownership was something I knew a thing or two about. That night, I sat on my porch under a sky scattered with stars, nursing a glass of bourbon and letting the silence of the land wash over me. The coyotes yipped in the distance, the frogs croaked near the pond, and I realized that Karen and her board had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated just how much a man can fight when you back him into a corner. I thought about my father's words, the land remembers who respects it and who abuses it. And suddenly, the path ahead became clear. If they wanted to play games with ownership and authority, then I'd show them what real ownership looked like. They wanted to treat me like an outsider on my own land. Fine, I'd take the very ground beneath their precious hiking boots and make it mine in a way they couldn't touch, couldn't fine, couldn't march around with their clipboards pretending to control. As the bourbon burned warm in my chest, a slow grin crept across my face. They thought fining me was the end of the story. But it was just the beginning. The days after that HOA meeting felt like walking around with a target painted on my back. Everywhere I went in town, it seemed like someone had heard some twisted version of the story. At the diner, the waitress who usually kept my coffee cup filled to the brim suddenly poured with hesitation, her eyes darting toward the corner booth where Karen and two of her cronies sat whispering like gossiping crows. At the hardware store, a couple of neighbors avoided me altogether, staring at paint samples with an intensity that no man has ever applied to paint before. Word had spread, and like all rumors, it had grown legs. By midweek, I wasn't just the guy who got fined for hunting, I was apparently the dangerous loose cannon firing bullets into backyards, terrorizing children, and threatening the HOA board with violence. If I believed half of what I overheard, I'd have called the sheriff on myself. That's the thing about people like Karen, they don't need the truth when they have perception. She was masterful at it, too, planting just enough seeds of doubt so that even the folks who liked me wondered if maybe, just maybe, I had stepped too far. I tried to laugh it off at first. When a neighbor told me she'd heard I'd nearly shot a hiker, I chuckled and said, funny, because the only hiker out there that day was a deer, and he's in my freezer now. But the laughter didn't reach my eyes, and they could tell. The whispers, the side eyes, the subtle shifts when I walked into a room, it all started grinding me down. By Friday, the fine notice sat on my kitchen counter like a loaded gun, the official letterhead glaring at me every time I walked past. Payment due in 30 days. 30 days to admit defeat. 30 days to hand Karen the win she'd been gunning for since the moment she set foot in this community. I could almost hear her gloating laugh echoing in my head, the way she tilted her head when she thought she'd cornered you. I knew paying wasn't an option, not financially, not morally, not in any damn sense of the word. But ignoring it wasn't an option either. They'd come after me harder, bury me in liens and legal jargon until I couldn't breathe. That's when the HOA meeting replayed in my mind, like a movie scene I couldn't turn off. Karen's smug voice, her pearls bouncing as she wagged her finger, and then the image that stuck harder than the rest, her and the board strutting down those trails on their so-called community hikes, acting like kings and queens of the forest. That hypocrisy burned hotter than the fine itself. They fined me for hunting, yet they spent every weekend marching through those same woods, snapping selfies, drinking boxed wine out of water bottles, and calling it bonding with nature. Saturday morning, I decided to clear my head. I saddled up my ATV and drove the back trails, the ones I knew like the lines on my hand. The air was crisp, the ground damp with dew, and for a few moments, it felt like the world had reset. Then, halfway down the ridge, I spotted them, Karen and her flock, a dozen strong, hiking poles clacking against the rocks, their neon jackets bright against the green of the forest. She was at the front, of course, leading them like Moses guiding the Israelites, though the only promised land she cared about was the spotlight. They didn't see me at first. I cut the engine and just watched, hidden behind a cluster of pines. They were loud, laughing, shouting to one another, tossing granola bar wrappers into the brush as they went. One guy even carved his initials into a tree with his pocketknife while another woman bent branches out of her way like she was swatting flies. Respectful of the land, my ass. They were trampling it, owning it in a way I never had. I hunted with patience, care, and reverence. They stomped through it like it was a theme park trail maintained for their amusement. And then Karen did something that lit the fuse. She stopped mid-trail, raised her voice, and said, "Isn't it wonderful we have these trails to ourselves? The community really needs places like this, away from people like, well, you know who." The group chuckled. A few glanced around nervously, but most laughed outright, their voices bouncing through the trees. You know who? Me. I felt the anger rise in my throat so thick I could taste it. That was the breaking point. Standing there, watching them treat the land like their personal playground while branding me as the villain, something in me shifted. It wasn't just about the fine anymore, or even about Karen. It was about principle, about the land itself, about respect. My father's words echoed in my ears. The land remembers who respects it and who abuses it. And in that moment, I swore that Karen and her board would remember too. I turned the ATV back toward home, the engine roaring as I tore through the trail. My mind wasn't calm anymore, it was racing, calculating, envisioning. I could fight the fine. I could hire a lawyer. But that would mean playing by their rules, stepping into their arena where Karen thrived. No, I needed a different battlefield, one they couldn't control with their little bylaws and gavel bangs. Something bigger, something that would flip the board upside down and leave them scrambling. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a half-empty bottle of bourbon and an old map of the county spread across the wood. Red and blue lines marked the property boundaries, the patchwork quilt of land ownership that stretched across the hills and valleys. I traced the hiking trails with my finger, winding them like a snake across parcels of land I knew didn't belong to the HOA. Some belonged to old farmers, some to absentee owners who'd long since moved away, and some were still for sale. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt: they didn't own the land under their precious hiking boots. They'd assumed, claimed, pretended, but assumption doesn't stand up in court. Ownership does, and ownership was something I could get. I leaned back in my chair, the bourbon warm in my chest, and let the idea settle. It was outrageous. It was audacious. It was exactly the kind of move Karen would never see coming. If they wanted to fine me for hunting, fine. But what would happen if I owned the very land they worshipped, the trails they strutted on, the woods they pretended were theirs? What would happen if, one day, they showed up for their hike and found a big, bold sign that said, "Private property, no trespassing"? I pictured the look on Karen's face, her mouth frozen mid-command, her clipboard useless in her trembling hands. The thought made me laugh, not the bitter kind this time, but the deep, belly-shaking kind I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since the fine arrived, I felt something like hope. No, not hope. Power. By the time the bottle was empty, the plan was clear. I didn't know exactly how I'd pull it off yet, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to fight them on their terms. I was going to change the game entirely. And when I did, they'd wish they'd never come after me in the first place. Sunday morning broke crisp and golden, the kind of morning that usually made me forget my troubles. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, sunlight dripped through the trees, and the sound of distant cattle lowing rolled over the hills. But this time, none of it brought peace. I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, staring out across my fields without really seeing them. All I could think about was Karen's smug face at the meeting, her voice echoing in my head like a broken record: "The fine stands. This matter is closed." Closed for her, maybe, but for me, it was just beginning. Around mid-morning, I heard the rumble of a diesel engine, and sure enough, a cloud of dust trailed up my gravel drive. It was my neighbor and longtime friend, Jack Rollins, pulling up in his beat-up Ford truck. Jack was the kind of man you wanted on your side in a fight: broad-shouldered, sunburned from years of ranching, and with a smirk that made you think he knew 3 jokes you'd never catch on to. He killed the engine, hopped down in his dusty boots, and gave me a wave. "Heard you stirred up the hornet's nest," he called as he walked up the steps. "Half the county's been talking about it." I groaned and rubbed my temples. Don't remind me. Apparently, I'm the new public menace. If you believe the gossip, I nearly wiped out a preschool with a stray bullet. Jack laughed, the deep belly kind that shook his shoulders. "Figures. Karen's got her claws in everyone. Truth doesn't matter, only the story she spins. So, what's your plan?" "That's the problem," I admitted, leaning back in my chair. "I don't have one. Can't pay the fine, won't pay the fine, and fighting them in court means stepping into their arena. You know how they work: paperwork, loopholes, intimidation. They'd eat me alive." Jack sat down across from me, stretching out his long legs. He dug a toothpick out of his pocket and rolled it between his teeth. "You're looking at it wrong. You're thinking about beating them on their terms. You gotta think about beating them on yours." I raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly does that mean?" He leaned forward, eyes glinting with mischief. "Buy the damn land out from under 'em. That's what I'd do." At first, I laughed. It sounded like one of Jack's jokes, the kind he dropped in casual conversation just to see your reaction. But when I saw the serious set of his jaw, my laughter died in my throat. "Buy the land," I repeated. "Sure," he said, shrugging as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Those trails they love so much. They don't own 'em, they just act like they do. Half that land belongs to old man Kavanaugh, and I heard he's been trying to sell off pieces for years. Then you've got the Harris family. They moved to Florida, left their parcel sitting empty. A man with cash and determination could scoop it up before Karen even knew what hit her." The idea hit me like a spark catching dry tinder. I leaned forward, my heart beating faster. You're serious. Dead serious, Jack said. You want to send a message. Don't waste your time arguing with Karen at meetings. She thrives on that. Take away what she loves most. Imagine her face when she marches her little hiking club out there and finds a sign that says, "Private property, no trespassing." Now that would be justice. I sat back, the thought spinning in my mind. At first, it seemed outrageous. Buying land just to stick it to the wall. That was the kind of crazy story you heard about in bars but never saw play out in real life. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Ownership wasn't just power, it was the ultimate trump card. The WA could make rules until their pens ran dry, but none of it mattered if the land wasn't theirs. And the irony, oh, the sweet irony, of them trespassing on my land after fining me for hunting on my own property. That alone was worth the price. Still, doubt crept in. That kind of money doesn't grow on trees, Jack. I'm not exactly sitting on a fortune. He waved a hand. You don't need to buy the whole county, just the key pieces. Trails don't run in straight lines, they cross parcels. You grab the choke points, the land they need to access the rest, and boom. Trails useless. Even if you just close one section, it ruins their whole route. I rubbed my chin, staring out at the woods as if they'd suddenly grown more valuable overnight. And you think the owners would sell? Jack smirked. Everyone's willing to sell if the offer's fair. Especially if they've been sitting on land they don't use. Besides, you're not some slick developer coming in to bulldoze everything. You're a local. You respect the land. That matters. For the first time since the fine arrived, I felt the weight in my chest lift. The idea wasn't just possible, it was poetic. The thought of Karen showing up with her clipboard and finding a locked gate, her little empire crumbling because she'd overlooked the most basic rule of all, ownership, made my blood hum with satisfaction. Jack must have seen the grin spreading across my face, because he slapped his knee and laughed. There it is. That's the look of a man ready to make trouble. You do this, and Karen won't know what hit her. I laughed too, the sound surprising even me. Hell, Jack, maybe you're onto something. Damn right I am, he said, standing and clapping me on the shoulder. Think it over, but don't think too long. Word travels fast, and if Karen catches wind of this plan, she'll try to block you before you even start. After he left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the map I'd left on the kitchen table the night before. I traced the trails again, this time not with frustration, but with purpose. Each line wasn't just a path through the woods, it was leverage, opportunity, revenge. The spark of an idea had caught flame, and now I couldn't put it out. Jack was right, fighting Karen in meetings was pointless. But buying the ground beneath her feet, that was a war one could win. By the time the sun set, I'd made up my mind. Tomorrow, I'd start making calls. Karen thought she'd close the matter. She had no idea it was only just beginning. I thought the hard part would be coming up with the idea, I didn't realize the hard part would be the paperwork. Turns out revenge has a boring administrative side. The next morning I rolled into the county clerk's office feeling equal parts sleuth and veteran. Sweater vest swapped for dusty jacket, confidence propped up by bourbon-flavored bravado, and was immediately humbled by the sameness of it all. A beige room humming with fluorescent lights, a row of computers, a woman at the counter chewing gum and asking for my ID like I'd just confessed to a misdemeanor. Public records, she said, as if the phrase were a public nuisance. You'll need the parcel numbers, hun. I stared at her, then at the stacks of plaid maps on the wall, and realized I'd forgotten the first rule of bureaucracy, they never make it easy on purpose. So I learned the maps, the old-fashioned way. I spread out a county plat like it was a treasure map and traced the ridgelines, the creeks, the snaking trail Karen liked to lead her minions down. Parcels were little rectangles and squares, a patchwork stitched together over 100 years, some names as familiar as church pews, Kavanaugh, Harris, Delgado, others listed as LLCs with cold, corporate names that meant absentee owners. Each parcel had a number, and each number unlocked a history if you knew where to look. I started punching them into the computer, pulling up deeds, tax records, and mortgage filings. Every click felt like peeling back a layer of a place most people only ever glanced at while driving to Costco. Old Man Kavanagh's parcel was the one everyone mentioned at the diner. He'd been the kind of farmer who kept to himself, sold off portions of his land when the knees wouldn't let him chase cattle anymore. His parcel history read like a family saga, transfers, inheritance notices, a foreclosure scare in the late 90s, but the bottom line was clear, he'd sold off a ribbon of land along the trail. few years back and kept a stub that had little use other than nostalgia. The Harris parcel was more interesting, an out-of-state mailing address, a delinquent property tax notice from the previous year, and a realtor's, for sale, flyer that looked like it had been posted in 2017 and forgotten. My pulse picked up. Delinquent taxes meant motivated sellers. Motivated sellers meant a phone number and, with luck, a handshake. Research felt like prospecting. I left the clerk's office with photocopies tucked under my arm and a modest swagger that only lasted until the first conversation. The phone calls were the part of the job that made me miss the simplicity of a shotgun and a deer. People answered in ways that told you who they were, some with the terse politeness of someone used to reroutes, others with the warm suspicion of those who've had too many strangers call asking about their land. Yes, boomed a voice when I reached an elderly number tied to the Kavanaugh stub. Who's this? I told him I was a neighbor and that I'd been looking into the old trail and the parcel line. There was a long silence, and I imagined him polishing a rifle or a glass. Finally, we ain't selling, son. Firm, final. My heart thudded. I pictured Karen's smug face and felt the sting. No problem, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. I just wanted to check. He muttered something about kids not respecting land anymore and hung up. The polite lie, the first no. I hadn't expected a yes right away. The Harris family was more promising. A young woman named Liz answered, a soft drawl and a tired undertone. She admitted they'd thought about renting the land to a neighbor but had never found the time, and truth be told, they were behind on taxes and would consider offers. Her hesitation smelled of possibility. We set a meeting for the following weekend. Small victories were like tinder, you had to keep feeding them before they fizzled. I spent the days between meetings knocking on doors, walking property lines, and making friends with the land registry clerk who'd learned early on that I knew my plat maps. You're spending a lot of time on one little trail, she observed, and I shrugged like it was nothing. People get sentimental, she said, handing me a Xerox deed with a thumb that left a smudge like a fingerprint of fate. Sentimental or not, there was money involved, and money complicates sentiment faster than rain ruins a picnic. On the ground, the trails told a different story than the maps. Where plat lines were neat and official, the land itself was messy, overgrown hedgerows, a rusted fence post half buried in moss, a fallen oak that had redirected a path into a sinuous, softer route. I walked those trails like an investigator, logging choke points and access routes, noting where a single locked gate could force a mile-long detour. If I could buy those narrow slices, I thought, I could stubborn the whole route. It's amazing how strategic land becomes when your goal isn't building a subdivision but closing a dog-eared chapter in a bully's playbook. The face-to-face meetings were the oddest part of the hunt. Liz Harris met me at a picnic table under an elm, her hair pulled back, a toddler asleep in a baby carrier on her chest like some domestic mascot of responsibility. She talked about moving to Florida for work, about the hassles of absentee ownership, about the paperwork that piled up like dust. We don't use the land, she said quietly, looking out over the slope where the trail curled out of sight. It's just there. And then there's taxes. It's been more headache than it's worth. She flinched when I mentioned Karen and the HOA. Her eyes darted with the awareness of someone who'd been in the crossfire but hadn't wanted to pick sides. Negotiations were practical, not vindictive. There was a price, a transfer, a sincere thanks on both sides when we signed the preliminary agreement. I left with a deed in my inbox and a small surge of triumph that felt part thief, part patriot. But for every Liz, there was an obstinate Kavanaugh who clung to his last parcel, and a developer LLC that wanted 6 times the land's worth for a sliver nobody used. Every victory required patience and a willingness to meet the human element, fear, grief, pride, the random need to believe in something that isn't measured in dollars. I learned to read the pauses, the qualifiers, the way a seller might say, I'll think about it, and mean a polite no, or a bargaining chip. I bartered like I'd never bargained before, offering to maintain access for livestock in exchange for a lower price, promising to preserve a creek's riparian buffer, dropping in small favors like mowing the path in exchange for signatures. It felt oddly noble and deeply petty at the same time. Word got around, of course. Small towns have a way of knowing before you tell them. I started getting questions, some direct, some thrown over the fence in passing. You buying land? An older woman asked, fingernails sinking into her gardening gloves as if she were squeezing the answer out of me. What for? The question hung between us like a guillotine blade. I learned to smile and deflect, to say vague things about stewardship and preservation and the health of the watershed. The fewer people who knew the real motive, the better. Secrets were tools. The right secrecy turned a plan into a trap. The weekend I closed on the Harris parcel felt like a small coronation. Liz handed me the keys in a paperwork packet that smelled faintly of printer ink and relief. We shook hands, a warm, human exchange that made the whole scheme feel less like malice and more like a necessary correction. As I drove the new boundary line back to my place, the setting sun washed the hills in molten gold. The trail that once threaded freely across multiple owners now had a new stitch in the fabric, my name on the deed, official and immovable in the county records. Privilege had shifted by a few inches of paper, but those inches were everything. There were setbacks, calls from lawyers representing absentee owners who'd had second thoughts, a neighbor who complained when I installed a temporary gate, and a late-night visit from someone who left a dead raccoon on my porch like an ominous punctuation mark. Threats were part of the job now. I took them as badges of honor. Each jab hardened my resolve. There were more parcels to go, more choke points to secure. The hunt for ownership was messy, bureaucratic, and occasionally cruel, but it was working. Every signed deed was a small victory, and with each one, the trail Karen loved slipped further from her reach. By the time autumn started to bruise the leaves, I had more than a plan, I had momentum. The paperwork sat in a neat stack on my kitchen table, each deed a quiet, deadly promise. The land remembered, sure, but I'd learned something else. The law remembers too. You just had to know how to feed it the right documents. And I was getting very good at feeding it what it wanted. The strangest thing about buying land isn't the dirt itself, it's how silent the whole process can be if you play your cards right. You'd think neighbors would notice someone moving in on property that backed up to their favorite hiking trails, but in a town like ours, most people only paid attention when gossip had a name attached. As long as I stayed quiet, as long as I let the papers do the talking, I could move mountains without so much as raising an eyebrow. Closing on the Harris parcel had given me a taste of blood. It wasn't enough. The trail wound through 3 other slices of land, and if I wanted to choke off the HOA's playground, I needed more than just one stitch in the quilt. I needed to sew up the whole seam. That meant finding every choke point, every gate, every bottleneck where one stubborn deed could block them like a boulder across a road. And I did. Nights were spent hunched over plat maps, coffee rings staining the edges, while I circled parcels like a hunter marking tracks. The real fun came when I learned just how undervalued some of those parcels were. See, land without road access is like a car without wheels, it might look good, but nobody wants the trouble. Except me. I wasn't buying it to build a house or graze cattle. I was buying it to slam a door in Karen's face. And that made land no one else cared about absolutely priceless to me. Negotiations weren't the dramatic backroom deals I'd imagined as a kid watching westerns. They were awkward kitchen table conversations with old men who smelled of tobacco and mothballs, or phone calls with absentee heirs who lived 2 states over and hadn't set foot on the property since the Bush administration. One man, a retired machinist named Dalton, answered the door in suspenders, suspicious as a guard dog. "You with the county?" he barked before I'd said a word. When I told him I wanted to buy his back lot, the overgrown, thorn-choked wedge that just happened to be where the HOA's trail slipped through, his suspicion turned to disbelief. "That patch," he laughed, "ain't worth the ticks crawling on it." I slid my offer across his table, and the laughter died. Silence. The kind of silence that makes a man realize junk has value, if only to someone else. 2 weeks later, the deed was mine. Not every seller was easy. One parcel was tied up in probate, 3 siblings clawing over who deserved what. I had to sit through a dinner of rubbery lasagna while they argued, their voices sharp enough to cut the air. I let them fight, let them vent about Karen and the wahoo'd been pestering them about easement rights. Then I leaned in, calm as a preacher, and told them I could end the fight today with a clean check. They blinked. Money talks louder than blood when it's enough to settle old grudges. A month later, I walked away with another link in my chain. The hardest part wasn't convincing owners. It was hiding what I was doing from the HOA. Karen had a nose like a hound when it came to other people's business, and if she caught wind of my plan before the ink dried, she'd find a way to throw sand in the gears. So I moved like a shadow. I set up a shell LLC, Timberline Holdings, the kind of bland, corporate name no one looks twice at. Every deed I signed went under that umbrella, every tax bill routed to a P.O. box 3 towns over. To the casual eye, it looked like some investment group was picking up scraps. To Karen, it would look like nothing at all, until the day it mattered. But secrecy came with its own headaches. Banks don't like bland shell companies unless you grease the right wheels. I found myself sitting across from loan officers in stiff ties, pretending I was building a portfolio for conservation easements and future timber value. They nodded like they understood, but I saw the flicker of doubt. "You sure you don't want to survey for mineral rights?" one asked, tapping his pen. I bit back a laugh. If only he knew I just wanted to shut down a glorified walking club. The bureaucracy was endless. Stacks of forms, notaries, title insurance, lawyers who charged by the sigh. Revenge, I learned, costs in patience as much as it costs in dollars. Back at the ranch, the silence of my plan sometimes pressed heavy. Neighbors would wave, ask me if I'd be joining the next community hike. I'd smile, nod, play dumb. Inside, I could barely contain the grin. Because by then, I owned enough choke points that the trail was no longer theirs, it was mine, even if they didn't know it yet. Every step they took on those woods was a trespass waiting to be enforced. The night I tacked the first, "No trespassing, private property," sign to a weathered oak, my hands shook. Not from fear, but from the thrill of it. It was quiet, just the chirp of crickets and the smell of pine sap as I drove the nails in. That sign wasn't just metal on wood, it was a loaded gun pointed at Karen's precious community spirit. And she had no clue it was already cocked. The silent purchase was nearly complete. All that was left now was timing. And timing, I knew, would be everything. I'd been waiting for the day like a man waits for lightning, knowing it's coming, feeling the charge in the air, but also knowing there's nothing you can do to hurry it along. Word had leaked, quietly, like a rumor that slips past a closed door, and somehow the HOA had decided that this coming Saturday would be the perfect day for their seasonal community hike. Perfect, because they loved spectacle, loved showing off their little rituals to anyone who would clap politely. Perfect, because it gave me a target. I spent the week moving like a librarian, arranging a particularly satisfying revenge shelf. Signs printed, nails and posts gathered, a small lock that didn't look like much but would look plenty official when attached to a chain. I wrapped each sign in a towel at midnight like a man wrapping a present he couldn't wait to give his tormentor. The plan was beautifully simple. I'd waited until the trails were reserved on Karen's calendar, waited until the flyers were pinned and the emails went out with that syrupy sweet subject line, "Join us for a refreshing hike." Then, the night before, while the town slept and crickets did what crickets do best, I would walk the route and place my signs at choke points, where a single gate would force the entire hike to stop dead in its tracks. No shouting, no dramatic speeches, just property law and offense. I liked the idea that the thing that would stop them was as mundane and unglamorous as a piece of chain. It felt right. I left the truck at the edge of the field and carried the signs in like a burglar who believed in civic duty. The moon was a sliver, the woods black except for the way leaves glanced silver in the breeze. My boots made soft thuds on the trail. Each sign felt weightier than the last, metal plates with bold, block letters that said exactly what needed saying: private property, no trespassing. I hammered the first one into a post where the trail narrowed between two mossy stones. The second went up where a fallen oak had created a natural gateway. By the time I hung the last one on the old split rail fence, sweat matted my hair and my palms were sore, but a grin had carved itself under my skin. I stood back and let the sign speak for me. Morning arrived with a kind of ridiculous optimism you only see before somebody's day gets thoroughly ruined. The sun eased over the hills and the town filled with the sort of polite small talk that pretends everything is well. I had a cup of coffee in my hand and a pair of binoculars in my truck. It felt mildly theatrical, but then, so did Karen's whole life. At 8:15, I saw the first hatchback creep around the bend, then another, then a caravan of cars with smiling people clutching reusable water bottles and wearing matching hiking socks. They all funneled onto the gravel pull-off and poured out like obedient ants following a leader. Karen stood at the front of the line, clipboard in hand, sari-like scarf fluttering even though there was no breeze. Her sunglasses were back on, as always, a ridiculous affectation that made her look like she'd stepped out of a mid-budget reality show. She gathered her flock with the kind of inspirational chirp you reserve for preschool teachers handing out stickers. "All right, everyone, remember to stay on the trail and pick up any litter," she called, and the group cheered like they'd received instruction in sainthood. For a second they looked like a happy little club, until they noticed the signs. Everything shifted. The cheer died like a candle snuffed. The leader's chirp turned to a squawk, and Karen's lips thinned. She marched forward, the heels on her shoes going tap-tap against the gravel, and stopped in front of the first sign like a general confronting an insult. Her hand went to her clipboard as if her ritual could rewrite the words hammered into the wood. "What is this?" she demanded, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "This is public land, and these signs are clearly fraudulent." A woman named Claire from the board, one of Karen's more reasonable-sounding cronies, stepped forward and peered at the sign. "It says private property," she said slowly, as if the concept itself was unfamiliar. "Maybe the county changed something." Her voice wavered just enough to let the rest of the group smell the fear. I watched them, every muscle in me tight like a drawn bow. Some of the hikers fanned out, looking for an alternative route as if hope could be stumbled upon like a lost dog. A few were openly annoyed, pushing past the signs with the kind of self-entitled grit that only people who never had to cut their own would display. But most stood there, mouths ajar, as if the universe had replaced the script they'd been handed with something foreign and inconvenient. Karen didn't like not being in control. 2 years earlier she'd reorganized the holiday lights schedule because someone had dared change the bulb rotation in the common area. Now, faced with a stationary moral code, words on metal, she floundered. She marched up and ripped the nail from the post with a strength that suggested practice at dramatic gestures, then turned the sign over, looking for a stamp, a name, any mark that would justify her fury. There was nothing. Plain metal, plain words, and my name burned on the back in small print, Timberline Holdings. Her face went pale enough it made me consider sending her a sympathy card. Instead she shoved the sign into a folding chair and slapped her clipboard down like it was a badge. "This is illegal," she announced to the group, voice pitched high with the certainty of someone who'd never had to check a deed. "We will not be intimidated." One of the hikers, a middle-aged man with a rat tail and a propensity for bravado, strode forward and said, "We can just walk around it. It's not like one stupid sign can stop us." He made as if to step past the fallen oak, but at that moment a rustle and a thump came from the gap in the trees. Behind the oak, a new, tidy gate stood where there had been none the day before, its chain looped and locked with a small brass padlock glinting in the sun. The man froze as if a ghost had spoken his name. Murky glances shot toward the gate, then back at Karen. "How? Who?" she started, each word flailing. The hikers looked like extras in a play who'd just had the script rewritten mid-performance. A woman began to cry softly, small sobs muffled by the hem of her scarf. Another started to video the scene, the tiny rectangle of her phone reflecting the tableau like a judge's gavel. Then Claire asked the question that would be the fulcrum of every argument for the coming weeks: "Is this legal? Did someone call the county?" Her voice held the practical panic of someone thinking of paperwork instead of principle. Karen's jaw set. "I will call the board lawyer," she said. "I will call the county. This is harassment." She did call, too. I could see her from where I sat, the phone hugged to her ear, her voice tight as she recounted the atrocity. Someone in the back of the group muttered about trespassing laws and collective responsibility. Someone else muttered that the board had probably placed the signs themselves as an elaborate prank. The group fractured into conspiracies and accusations like a cracked wagon wheel. A few neighbors, braver than the rest, walked up the path to argue with me directly. "Why would you do this, Mrs. Alvarez?" asked in a voice that was more hurt than angry. "This trail has been part of our family hikes for years." Her eyes shone as if she'd been looking forward to bringing her grandchildren down the familiar route. I stepped down from my truck and met her gaze, feeling a flicker of discomfort at the human cost of what I'd done. "Because those hikes trample the land," I said simply, and then added, softer, "and because they find me for hunting on my own property." She frowned, confusion battling loyalty. "But why close it to everyone?" she said. "Why punish all of us?" It was a fair question, the kind that would later be chewed over at kitchen tables and bar counters. In that moment, though, my answer was simple and petty and true: sometimes you have to hurt a few feelings to stop a bigger wrong. Before she could reply, Karen was on her feet, mobilizing the group with an efficiency that made me begrudgingly admire her. "Everyone, we'll wait here until the county sends someone," she said. "No one leave the area." Her plan was perfectly bureaucratic. Summon an authority, roll in a neutral voice, and have them declare what everyone else wanted to be true. It was also predictable, and predictable is an advantage when you're waiting for a reaction. I watched them form a small camp at the trailhead, people huddled together like a flock of nervous birds. I could have walked up then and owned the moment, could have strode to them and delivered the triumphant speech I'd rehearsed 1,000 times in my head. But something in me knew to wait. The law moves slow, and drama makes bad evidence. I settled back into the truck with my binoculars and watched as the world I'd irritated moved through its predictable panic. And then, as if the universe enjoyed a good bit of theater as much as I did, Karen lifted her head and pointed, her arms slicing the air toward the far edge of the trail where trees thinned and a dirt road met the horizon. A pickup truck was coming down that road, not with the casual pace of a town pickup but with the deliberate stomp of someone who meant business. It had the sheriff's emblem parked right on the door. Every head turned toward the approaching vehicle like a flower to the sun. My stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. The sheriff's truck pulled up, engine ticking down, and out stepped Deputy Morales, steady, polite, the sort of lawman who'd been county sheriff long enough to know both statutes and people. He tipped his hat, looked at the signs, and then at the cluster of people, and his face gave nothing away. "Morning," he said. "Someone called about private property." The chatter rose into a frantic hum of accusations and explanations and counterclaims. The hikers pointed, the board gestured, Karen recited the fine with the fervor of a liturgist. I watched Morales listen, his jaw working slowly as he took in the scene. Then he reached into his truck and pulled out a small, official-looking envelope. "I'm going to need to see the deeds for this property," he said quietly. "Until we sort that out, I suggest no one crosses these signs." The words landed like a gavel. Around me, breathing slowed, people's faces dropped from red-hot indignation to a puzzled, embarrassed gray. Karen's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She looked like a queen who'd just been told the crown belonged to someone else. As Morales began walking toward the folding chair where Karen had shoved the first sign, I felt a strange wash of triumph and dread in equal parts. The deed packets were in my truck, but I wasn't the one who'd elected to step forward first. I watched him reach the chair, and then, even from a distance, I could see his eyes flick to the back of the sign where Timberline Holdings was written in small print. His fingers hesitated over the paper like a man about to open a book he isn't sure he should read. In that heartbeat, as the sheriff's deputy reached for the name that would change everything, I felt the floor drop out from under me and the entire town hold its breath. Deputy Morales had that look, steady, unreadable, the kind that made you feel guilty even if you hadn't done a thing wrong. He turned the sign in his hand, thumb grazing the back where Timberline Holdings, LLC was stamped in neat block letters. The crowd leaned forward like they were waiting for a magician to reveal the card. Karen was practically vibrating, her scarf twitching like it was tethered to her rage. "Well," she demanded, arms folded, voice sharp enough to cut barbed wire. "Is this legal? Can someone just slap up signs and claim land like a child playing fort?" Morales adjusted his hat, calm as a pond at dawn. "Depends who owns it," he said. Then his gaze shifted to me. He didn't call my name, didn't need to. Everyone turned as one, eyes zeroing in on the man leaning against a dusty white pickup parked just far enough away to look casual. My coffee thermos was still warm in my hand, but suddenly it felt like a prop in a play. Karen's sunglasses caught the sun like twin daggers. "You," she hissed, her finger snapping out like she was pointing at a felon on a wanted poster. "This is your doing." I pushed off the truck slowly, letting the weight of silence build as I walked toward them. Boots crunching gravel, each step steady, deliberate. "Morning," I said, nodding at Morales. "You wanted to see the deeds." Karen barked a laugh, shrill and ugly. "Deeds, please. You think you can waltz in here and make some fake paperwork? This is our community trail. It belongs to the people." She spread her arms like a preacher addressing a congregation, the crowd murmuring behind her. I set my thermos on the hood of the deputy's truck and pulled a thick manila folder from under my arm. The flap was stuffed with papers, signed deeds, notarized transfers, title insurance receipts, the kind of documentation that didn't just whisper ownership but shouted it from the courthouse steps. "It doesn't belong to the people," I said, calm but sharp. "It belongs to whoever holds the deed. And right now, that's me." I handed the stack to Morales. He flipped through with deliberate patience, lips pressing tighter with each page. He paused to adjust his glasses, then nodded. "These are valid," he said simply. The murmurs behind Karen turned to gasps. Someone whispered, "Oh my God, he really owns it." Another muttered, "All this time." Karen's face drained of color, then flushed an alarming shade of crimson. This is harassment. She snapped. This is targeted intimidation. He's just doing this to spite me because of his hunting fine. I let the words hang before answering. You're damn right it's about the fine, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You fined me for using my own land. You marched your little hiking clubs through property you didn't own, like it was your personal park. So I bought the land under your feet. That trail you love so much. It's not yours anymore. It's mine. And it's closed. The crowd erupted, half gasps, half applause. A few people, fed up with Karen's iron rule, even cheered openly. Others looked uneasy, caught between loyalty and relief. Karen tried to rally. She jabbed a manicured finger at me, shrieking, "You can't do this. We'll sue. We'll take it to the county board, the state, the—" Karen, Morales interrupted, his voice a calm blade cutting through her fury. "I've reviewed the paperwork. He owns it. If you or anyone else crosses past those signs, you'll be trespassing. And I will enforce it." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Karen's jaw worked, her face twitching with the kind of rage that had nowhere to go. For the first time in all the years I'd known her, she looked powerless. I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough that only the front of the crowd caught the edge. "You wanted to control me. You wanted to make an example of me. Well, congratulations. You did, but you made the wrong example. Because now everyone sees what happens when you push too hard." Her hands shook around her clipboard, knuckles white as bone. She looked ready to explode, but there was no fuel left. Morales still held the deeds. The crowd was no longer hers. Finally, she snapped the clipboard shut and spat out, "This isn't over." Then she turned on her heel, storming back to her SUV. The scarf fluttered behind her like a retreating banner. The hikers scattered, some muttering, some laughing, a few clapping me on the back as they passed. "Good for you," one said. About time someone stood up to her. Another shook his head. "You know she won't stop, right?" I did know. Karen wasn't the type to take defeat quietly. But for the first time in a long time, the balance had shifted. The HOA's queen had been knocked off her throne, and the trail, their symbol of control, was gone. As Morales handed me back the deeds, he gave me a small nod. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said. I smiled, sliding the papers back into the folder. "Good," I replied. I brought the smoke, and for the first time, Karen had no fire left to fight it with. The fallout started before the dust from Karen's SUV tires had even settled on the gravel road. Word travels fast in a small community, but gossip fueled by WA drama. That moves at the speed of light. By the time I'd finished stacking the deeds neatly back into my folder and climbed into my truck, I could already see phones out, neighbors whispering, photos of my no trespassing signs flying into text threads like contraband leaflets. I wasn't just the guy who hunted on his own land anymore, I was the man who had just stolen their Sunday stroll. By that evening, the neighborhood Facebook group was on fire. Karen had written a post dripping with righteous fury, complete with all caps, 6 exclamation points, and the kind of passive-aggressive tone you could practically hear through the screen. "Attention community members, certain selfish individuals have taken extreme and illegal actions to block our beloved hiking trail. Rest assured, your WA is fighting this injustice." Beneath it, the comments split like an earthquake fault line. Half of them read like a fan club. Finally someone put Karen in her place. "He owns the trail, Karen. Deal with it, I'll buy this man a beer." The other half, though, sounded like a militia. "This is our trail, how dare you take it from us? What about our kids? Where are they supposed to walk? We should all just hike it anyway, he can't stop all of us." I watched it unfold with popcorn-worthy amusement, though my phone buzzed so much I had to mute the notifications before it shook itself off the table. Friends I hadn't heard from in years were sending texts, "Heard you made the evening entertainment. Nice work." Even my cousin in the next county called laughing so hard he could barely breathe. "Man, you went nuclear." He howled. That woman's head must be spinning like a tornado. But it wasn't just digital fireworks. The real-world consequences landed quick. The next morning, I found a small group of residents clustered at the trailhead, looking at the new signs like mourners at a funeral. An older couple glared at me when I walked by. "You didn't have to be so cruel," the woman snapped. "We've been hiking the trail for 20 years. I paused. "And in those 20 years, did you ever once ask whose land you were on?" Her silence was answer enough. Still, not everyone was angry. One man grinned at me across his lawn, lifting a mug of coffee in salute. Later that day, a neighbor knocked on my door with a six-pack in hand. "Cheers to finally shutting her down," he said, jerking his head toward the HOA president's house. "You're a damn legend." Karen, meanwhile, was unraveling. She called an emergency HOA board meeting that night, summoning her loyalists to the clubhouse like a general rallying troops after a lost battle. I didn't attend, but the walls in that place are thin, and by the second hour, her voice carried halfway down the street. "Unacceptable abuse of authority," she shrieked. "Grounds for a lawsuit. Community rights must prevail." Every sentence ended with the thump of her clipboard against the table. By the time the meeting adjourned, rumors spread that the HOA planned to hire a lawyer and take me down. Of course, that meant raising dues, something that made even her staunchest supporters squirm. More than one neighbor muttered that they didn't pay monthly fees just to bankroll Karen's vendettas. The community began to fracture. Some residents avoided me like I was radioactive, others stopped to chat in open defiance of Karen's reign. Fences suddenly seemed taller, waves frostier. Where there had once been a neighborhood pretending at unity, now there were two camps, those secretly enjoying Karen's downfall, and those clinging desperately to her brand of order. And then there was Karen herself. She drove past my house twice a day, slowing just enough to glare out her tinted windows. Once, I caught her parked at the edge of the pasture, scribbling furiously into her ever-present clipboard like she was documenting war crimes. It was petty, it was pathetic, but it was also dangerous. I knew that look in her eyes, the look of someone who'd rather burn everything down than admit defeat. I should have felt nervous, maybe even guilty. Instead, I felt alive. For years, Karen had ruled this place with an iron fist wrapped in pastel cardigans, and for the first time, she'd been forced to taste her own medicine. She had lost her favorite playground, her control, her illusion of authority, and worse, she'd lost it to me, the man she'd tried to make an example of. But I also knew the battle wasn't over. The lawsuit threats, the scheming, the smear campaigns, they were coming. And the community, fractured as it was, would be the battlefield. As I stood at the edge of the closed trail one evening, watching the sunset wash the trees in molten gold, I thought about the fallout still to come. Karen wasn't just angry, she was cornered, and a cornered animal doesn't retreat, it lunges. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because if she wanted a war, I was ready. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, the kind of smell that tells you important battles have been fought here, marriages dissolved, wills contested, lives dissected in neat legal phrases. I sat at the defendant's table in my best boots and a jacket that hadn't seen the light of day since my niece's wedding. Across the aisle, Karen perched like a vulture, flanked by two HOA board members who looked more nervous than loyal. She wore her finest scarf, pearl earrings gleaming under the fluorescent lights, clipboard clutched like a holy relic. Her lawyer, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, shuffled papers with the enthusiasm of someone who realized he had been handed a lemon of a case. He cleared his throat, stood, and began his opening remarks. "Your Honor, this community trail has been used by residents for decades. It is a vital part of our neighborhood, and my client believes the defendant's sudden closure constitutes harassment, retaliation, and a violation of community rights." Karen nodded furiously, lips pursed in satisfaction, as if the case was already won. My attorney, an older rancher-turned-lawyer named Dan who believed in plain speech and sturdy handshakes, rose calmly. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady as a fence post, "what this really comes down to is property law. My client owns the land. He has the deeds, signed and notarized. What the HOA wants is to keep using something that isn't theirs. It's that simple." Judge Wexler, a no-nonsense woman with steel gray hair pulled into a bun tight enough to snap wire, leaned forward. "Let me see the deeds." Dan handed over the thick folder. She flipped through, page by page, her eyebrows arching only once before she snapped it shut. "These are legitimate," she said flatly. Karen shot upright. "But Your Honor, that trail has been part of our community since the subdivision was founded. We've walked it for years." The judge fixed her with a stare sharp enough to silence a chainsaw. "And in those years, did the HOA ever purchase or lease the land?" Karen's mouth opened, then shut. Her lawyer stammered, "Well, no, Your Honor, but precedent of use." "Precedent of use is not ownership," Judge Wexler interrupted. "This isn't kindergarten. You don't get to keep a toy just because you've played with it long enough." A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom, quickly hushed by the bailiff's stern glare. Karen's face burned red, but the judge wasn't done. Furthermore, Wexler continued, flipping back through the file, it appears the HOA levied a fine against the defendant for hunting on his own property. A fine they had no legal authority to issue. Dan leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a small grin playing at the corner of his mouth. Karen sputtered, it was for the safety of the community. Guns are dangerous. Wexler's gavel cracked once. Order. Mrs. Whitmore, your HOA overstepped its authority. Not only is this lawsuit without merit, but your board has wasted this court's time. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. As for damages, Wexler said, tapping her pen thoughtfully against the desk, I won't award them today. But be advised, if I see this HOA harassing the defendant again, I will entertain the idea of sanctions. Karen collapsed into her chair, her scarf drooping like a wilted flower. The judge rapped her gavel. Case dismissed. It was over in less than an hour, but the fallout lasted much longer. As we filed out, reporters from the local paper snapped photos. Neighbors who had taken the morning off work to spectate whispered behind their hands. Some smirked, others avoided Karen's eye altogether. Outside on the courthouse steps, Karen tried to save face. This isn't over, she barked at me, voice cracking. But it rang hollow now, the bravado of a queen without her crown. I tipped my hat, letting the sun catch the brim. Oh, it's over, I said. You just don't know it yet. Dan clapped me on the back. That, he drawled, was sweeter than a fresh peach in July. And he wasn't wrong. For the first time since this war began, I felt something I hadn't in months, peace. Sweet, undeniable, legal peace. The neighborhood had a different sound to it after the trial. Quieter, lighter, as if someone had finally let the air out of a balloon that had been stretched too tight for too long. No more 6 a.m. HOA patrols. No more warning letters tucked under windshield wipers for improper parking angles. And most importantly, no more smug little speeches from Karen at every block gathering. The trail signs stood firm, weatherproofed and anchored deep in the soil, their message clear, private property, no trespassing. At first, a few neighbors lingered near the old trailhead, hoping maybe I'd change my mind. But after a few weeks, they gave up. Some found new places to walk. Others, secretly relieved, admitted they hadn't enjoyed the group hikes anyway. A few even thanked me for giving them the perfect excuse to avoid Karen's forced, bonding events. Karen didn't vanish quietly. She tried, she tried. A new petition circulated, demanding the county intervene against land hoarding. She even set up folding chairs outside the HOA clubhouse and staged what she called trail justice protests. But without legal footing, without the threat of fines or board decrees, her power withered. One by one, her loyalists drifted away, tired of throwing good money and time after a lost cause. By the end, her protests looked more like lonely picnics, her clipboard resting on her lap while she muttered into her phone. The board finally had enough. At the next election, Karen was voted out in a landslide. Someone else, quiet, reasonable, more interested in potholes than power trips, took her place. And for the first time, the HOA meetings weren't battlefields, but boring discussions about landscaping budgets and mailbox paint. It was bliss. As for me, I kept to my land. The hunting fine that started all this felt like a story from another life. Sometimes I'd walk out to the closed trail at sunset, watching the light spill golden through the trees, and I'd smile at the silence. No chatter, no forced camaraderie, no clipboards. Just peace. Did I enjoy the victory? Absolutely. Did I savor watching Karen unravel, watching her empire crumble piece by piece? You bet I did, but the sweetest part wasn't the revenge. It was the reminder that some things are worth standing your ground for. That when someone tries to bully you out of your rights, you don't fold, you fight. And sometimes, fighting doesn't mean shouting the loudest. Sometimes, it just means buying the battlefield right out from under them. Because at the end of the day, that trail wasn't just dirt and trees. It was proof. Proof that their rules weren't law, that their control wasn't absolute. Proof that one man, with enough stubbornness and a well-timed checkbook, could flip the whole board upside down. Karen drove past my house less and less after her defeat. The last time I saw her, she didn't even glare. Just stared out the window, hollow-eyed, before speeding away. Maybe she was finally done fighting ghosts. Maybe she was just tired. Me, I leaned back on my porch, boots on the railing. Coffee in hand, the evening settling soft around me. And for the first time in years, this place felt like home again. The HOA hadn't just lost the trail. They'd lost the war, and I had won, on my terms, and permanently.